続きまして次の講演です。ハーバード大学のジョセフ・ナイ先生よりご講演いただきます。ナイ先生は歴代のアメリカ民主党政権で国務次官補などの要職を務められました。近年、スマートパワーという概念を用いた国家戦略を提唱されています。また、知日派の国際政治学者として日米関係に関するさまざまな政策提言をされています。演題は The Trump Effect on Foreign Policy、 トランプ政権の外交政策への影響です。ナイ先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you. It's nice to be back in Tokyo and to be again with Tokyo International University and Chancellor Kurata. I have a difficult topic to explain to you right now, which is Trump's foreign policy. And the reason it's difficult is because nobody quite knows what it is, including President Trump. I speak not as a political partisan when I say that, but as an analyst describing the fact that we have a very different type of president in President Trump. To understand President Trump, you have to realize that his background was in New York City real estate. He was not a businessman who had a business that was to be organized around the world. He did not have broad contacts in different areas. He was really not very experienced with the world. He also is a man, having dealt in New York real estate, who thinks primarily in doing deals, short-term deals. And the approach you take in doing these deals is often to make an extreme position and then come back and then bargain and settle for what you can get. I'm not saying anything that Trump himself hasn't said. If you want to read his book, The Art of the Deal, you'll see that this is how he explains his approach to things. But what's worth noticing is that's different from presidents that we've had in the past, in the sense that you don't have an articulation of a full strategy. What you've seen from the president is an attitude, which he calls America First, and an attitude of turning toward a more inward approach, but you don't have an articulation of a complete foreign policy. So when I say that I have a difficulty explaining this, it's because it hasn't been fully explained by the president himself. With that said, we can get some ideas of what the president has in mind and how radical and different it is by looking at his statements during the 2016 political campaign. It's worth noticing that President Trump was the first candidate of a major political party who called into question what's been called the liberal international order, or the set of alliances and institutions that were created after World War II. And if you look at that statements that he made during the campaign, they really were a very big departure from 70 years of tradition in American foreign policy. Americans have disputed deeply over foreign policy. The questions of the Vietnam War brought down the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, for example. The issue of Iraq and the invasion of Iraq meant that President George W. Bush lost the Congress in 2006, and it helped to elect President Obama in 2008. But these disputes, which have been important in foreign policy in the past, were usually about how much the United States should intervene in the internal affairs of less developed countries or poor countries to try to affect their internal regimes. In Vietnam, it was the question of trying to protect against communist takeover. In Iraq, it was about the Saddam Hussein regime and its access to weapons of mass destruction. These were bitter disputes, but they never questioned the overall framework of the post-1945 world order. Nobody said we should leave the World Trade Organization or we should drop NATO or something like that. So when President Trump articulated his views in the 2016 campaign, it really was a radical departure. For example, he said that American alliances were obsolete. He said NATO is obsolete. He said in Asia, Japan and Korea might have to develop their own nuclear weapons and take care of their own security, rather than relying on the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. This was a huge departure from what had been the basis of American foreign policy. Now, that's an interesting perspective, and I should step back for a minute and say, how did this consensus develop which Trump departed from, and why did he depart from it? In the 1930s, the United States was not that much involved in the world. It really, if you look back historically, the United States becomes the world's largest economy around 1900. But it doesn't get deeply involved in global politics until 1917, when President Woodrow Wilson sends 2 million American troops to fight in World War I. That tips the balance in World War I. But in a sense, after the war, when Wilson's efforts to create a League of Nations fails, the Americans more or less go home. We don't ratify the League of Nations. We don't stay deeply involved in international politics. And the net effect is that Britain, which had been the strongest country in the international economy, which had provided such global public goods as freedom of the seas, a relatively open international trading system, a relatively stable international monetary standard, Britain had been so weakened by World War I that it could no longer provide those global public goods. And the United States, which had become strong, didn't step up to the position it should take. Essentially, it acted like a free rider. And that produced the disastrous decade of the 30s, which was marked by a deep depression, genocide, and World War II. The lessons that Americans learned from that failure after 1945 is that we could not go home again, that we could not leave the rest of the world to itself, that if you're the largest country, you have no choice but to help provide certain global public goods, because if you don't, nobody else can. And that was the lesson that was basic to the consensus on American foreign policy after World War II. We sometimes call that the liberal international order. How liberal it is an open question, but it consisted of a set of alliances. It consisted of a set of institutions relating to economic affairs, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and eventually the World Trade Organization. And it also consisted of a number of other UN-based institutions and frameworks for preserving the international public order. Now, that, as I said, was the grounds for a broad consensus in American foreign policy. It takes shape gradually and starts in 1947 when the British tell President Truman that they can no longer provide the help to Greece and Turkey to protect them against Soviet aggression, and the United States declares what was called the Truman Doctrine to step in and provide assistance to those countries in protection against communism. The next year, it's followed by the Marshall Plan, where the U.S. provides assistance for the economic recovery of Europe. It's followed the year after that, in 1949, by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and so on. Basically a framework which provides some of these global public goods. Now, the question is, will Trump destroy that? Some people say, for example, give you a case in point, Edward Luce, who's a writer for the Financial Times, a very distinguished financial newspaper. Luce says that the 1945 order is over, that it's finished, that we've seen the end of it. And some people argue that this order is over because of the rise of China. You'll remember that there's been a great deal of concern about the growing power of China, and some people said China is passing the U.S., and that's why the 1945 order is over. Other people say, no, the threat to the 1945 liberal international order is less the rise of China than the rise of Trump. In other words, it's the rise of a populist ideology in the United States, but also in European countries like Britain, where you have the efforts, Brexit, to leave the European Union, and that this is really what is challenging this order. So we ought to take note of this and ask ourselves whether this larger framework of American foreign policy is over, and what is Trump, if anything, doing about it. Now, it's worth noticing that the Trump approach to alliances has been the approach of what you would call a transactional approach, which is each situation on its own. So he sees alliances in the type of framework much like he did real estate deals. Each deal you did as sharp a deal as you could, and you took your winnings and then went on to the next. But alliances in international diplomacy are more like marriages. You have to develop a relationship over time in which you develop a trust. And that's not the way Trump approached his real estate deals, and it's not the way he initially approached the question of alliances. But what's interesting, if you ask what's happened since January 20th, when Trump was inaugurated as president, you find that what he said in the campaign in relation to alliances, the security part of the post-45 international order, he changed his mind. He didn't say he changed his mind so quickly, but basically his practice did change. So, for example, I remember going to the Munich Security Conference, which is held every February in Munich, which pulls together top leaders from around the world. And Vice President Pence came, and Pence said that he believed in NATO and that the Article 5 guarantees of mutual security in NATO were very important and very real. But everybody wanted to know, does Trump believe that? So Pence, the vice president, said it, but the questions of all the people in the hall were, yes, but is he really speaking for the president? Well, about a month later, Trump decided that he would reaffirm this. So while he had said during the campaign that NATO is obsolete, by about March or April, he said, no, NATO is no longer obsolete. Well, that was an interesting change. And in the case of Asia, a lot of credit has to be given to Prime Minister Abe, who basically preempted Trump and visited Trump at Trump Tower before the inauguration and developed a personal relationship. And before you know it, Trump was no longer talking about abandoning the U.S.-Japan alliance, but was talking about keeping this alliance in Asia as well. So in the security dimension, the things that Trump said during the campaign that were very, very radical actually have been rolled back in the period after he's been president. Now, that's partly because of being educated by foreign leaders, including Prime Minister Abe. It's also because there is a very strong constituency in the United States for alliances such as the U.S.-Japan alliance. If you look at the Senate and the top legislators, they're strongly in favor of NATO and of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. If you look, and that's true of both political parties, if you look at the civil servants, what's sometimes called the permanent government, again, a deep support for this alliance structure, and same in the military. And if you look at public opinion polls will show a large support for both NATO and the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. So when Trump reversed himself on his campaign statements of this part of the post-1945 order, he essentially was moving in the direction of where public opinion was taking him. But that is not the whole story, because there still remains the open question of what will he do with the issues of institutions, and particularly institutions related to the global commons and trade. We've already seen the results in one case, which is the Paris Accords on climate change, where Trump announced that the United States was going to withdraw. We've also seen that in relation to the agreement on denuclearization of Iran, his refusal to certify that agreement to the Congress any longer. So we're seeing his beginning to draw back on that, and we're seeing it also in other institutions as well. A refusal to provide additional funds to the World Bank, cutting back on the U.S. Aid program, and refusing to appoint new lawyers and arbitrators to the dispute settlement mechanism of the World Trade Organization. So these are signs of moving in the wrong direction. And we're right now in the midst of a major effort to renegotiation the North American Free Trade Association, And it's not clear how that is going to turn out or how it will affect our relations with Mexico and Canada. Now, I think if you look at the trade question, that things are probably going to get more difficult rather than less so. In other words, I've described to you in the security area the fact that things got better. I'd love to tell you the same is going to be true of trade in institutions, but I'm not sure as an analyst that that's correct. Trump himself and some of the key people in his administration, like Wilbur Ross and Robert Lighthizer, the special trade representative, and Peter Navarro, a trade advisor, believe that trade surpluses are bad per se. Now, not many economists hold that view, that you measure trade relations just by bilateral surpluses. But Trump thinks that a bilateral surplus is a mark of an unfair trade relationship. So if you ask, where does the United States have big bilateral deficits, in other words, which countries have surpluses, which Trump condemns, outside of NAFTA, it's particularly China, Japan, and in Europe, Germany. And what that suggests is that there's bad news coming for those countries. Now, in the campaign, Trump talked about his intention to punish China by putting on tariffs against Chinese goods. When he met with Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago in February, he talked about the fact that he would be willing to go easy on some of the trade sanctions if Xi Jinping would help him on the problem of North Korea. In other words, what he was proposing to Xi Jinping is you take care of my problem with North Korea, and I'll go a little bit easier on you with trade. It looked at first, and the Chinese believed that this had taken the pressure off. But the problem is it's not clear that Xi Jinping can deliver Kim Jong-un. And if he's unable to deliver Kim Jong-un for the reasons that you heard Mr. Kimura say a few minutes ago, then what happens? Well, one possibility is that Trump says, I will use force. You know, if you're not going to help me on this, I'll use force. And we'll hear a little bit more when Mr. Okamoto, my friend Yukio, speaks afterwards about some of the problems with North Korea. And we can discuss it in our period of panel or discussions afterwards. But let's assume that there isn't a use of force and that there's no improvement in terms of North Korea's behavior, and Trump thinks that he did a deal with Xi Jinping back in February to go easy on trade if Xi Jinping would deliver Kim Jong-un. Well, Trump might then say, well, Xi didn't do his part of the deal, I'll now punish him on trade. So suppose you begin to get sanctions and tariffs against Chinese products. What does that do to the World Trade Organization? China presumably will retaliate. If you get a tit for tat, that's probably more than the traffic will bear for maintaining a rules-based international trading system. So we may be in for a period in the future in which we see the current situation as a calm before the storm in terms of the stability of this liberal international order. Another way of thinking of this is that we've had a breath of fresh air or a sigh of relief on the security aspects, the alliance structures of the post-1945 system, but we're waiting now to see whether there'll be another version of the storm when we get to the depth of the issues of trade. We've already seen some initial things, such as the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords, but we may see worse to come. So when you ask me to address the topic, the Trump effect on foreign policy, and I tell you I don't know, that's because nobody knows the answer to this. I was in Washington last weekend and met with a number of people, Republicans who had, including one who'd been the special trade representative for a prior Republican administration, and another person who'd been a Secretary of State in a prior Republican administration. I can't say their names because it was confidential, but they would not disagree with what I just said. They said, we just don't know. It's our party, he's president of our party, but we don't know where he's going to go on this. We don't know how the politics are going to play out in terms of inside the party, inside the Congress, but most of all, we don't know what Trump himself will actually do, because he's not a president who outlines a clear strategy, but he's a president who likes to do hard negotiations and pull surprises. So I apologize to you for not telling you the answer to the question of the Trump effect on foreign policy, but I'm afraid that's an accurate reflection of what the situation is. Now, obviously, next week, President Trump will be here in Asia, and particularly in Japan. And as Mr. Kimura just said, you have to deal with the American president you have. There's one president at a time. And what Mr. Kimura said is absolutely right. Prime Minister Abe has to deal with the president he has. And I would say thus far, Prime Minister Abe has showed a very great skill in terms of how he has dealt with President Trump. But what I'm trying to describe for you is be careful about your assumptions about the long run, because we don't know what's going to happen in terms of the years that to come. I think the alliance of the U.S. and Japan will remain strong. I think the U.S. and Japan have a common challenge, a common interest in managing the rise of Chinese power. We've just seen in the 19th Party Congress a China which is more nationalistic and more assertive. And in that sense, I think the question for the United States and Japan is, can we keep our working together in the security area as close as it's been, so that we can help to shape the environment which gives China incentive to be responsible, or what Robert Zoellick, former head of the World Bank, to become a responsible stakeholder. And I think the answer to that is yes. I think what we're going to see is better relations between India and Japan, between Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Modi. You're already seeing improved relations between the United States and India. And you're seeing in India a great concern about this Chinese assertiveness. Notice that India refused to attend the great celebration for One Belt, One Road. And India was quite irritated by the efforts that China made over the summer to have an effect on where the border, de facto border, is in Bhutan in terms of troops in that Himalayan region. So Indians are becoming wary about China. And I think the question that we're going to ask ourselves is, will more cooperation between Japan and India, as well as India and the U.S. Japan, can this provide a framework not to contain China, but to give China an incentive to behave more responsibly, more moderately? And I think the answer to that is yes. And I think because of that, the U.S.-Japan alliance and the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty is going to be firm, and I would expect it to last for the full 4 years of a Trump administration. But on the issues of trade and on the issues of a rules-based international system, which we have included in the meaning of the term a liberal international order or the post-1945 order, I think the game is still open. We don't know what's going to happen. Now, you can say, will this matter in the long run? Will this be a turning point in history, such as Edward Luce wrote? I think it's too soon to tell. My own view is that Trump is likely, from the point of view of 2030, if we look back as historians, I think we'll look back and say Trump was one of those odd personalities that is produced by the American political system. We produce odd people from time to time. Look at Senator Joseph McCarthy in the period after in the early days of the Cold War. Or look at Governor George Wallace, the populist governor of Alabama, who ran in 1968, and he took votes away from Hubert Humphrey, which meant Richard Nixon was elected president. So we've had populists who are quite extreme, and we look back at them from the history books today as saying the United States just produces some odd people from time to time. And one possibility is that the historians in 2030 will look back and say, well, remember those 4 years of Trump? That was an example of one of these odd people, or what you might call a blip on the curve of history. But if Trump is reelected, or if Trump gets us into a major war on the Korean Peninsula or in Iran, then he will turn out to be somebody who may be a turning point in American history and American foreign policy. You say, oh, but what are the prospects that he could get reelected when his polls are now only 36%? Well, imagine that the Democrats move so far to the left that they open up space in the middle for an independent party or somebody to try to create an independent party, which then splits the anti-Trump vote, and you could win with 36%. So you can't totally count out that he might be reelected. And ask, what are the prospects for war? We simply don't know. Trump has said he will not tolerate North Korea having a missile capability combined with a nuclear weapon. And he has said that all options are open, but we don't know what the probabilities in that case would be. But barring those two big ifs, if he's reelected, if there's a war, I think we'll look back from 2030 and say the answer to the question, the Trump effect on foreign policy, is that he was a blip, an unfortunate accident on a longer-term curve of the 1945 system persisting in producing a degree of international order. But if my two big ifs go wrong, if he's reelected or if there's a war, then the effects of Trump on American foreign policy may be something which will be a large chapter in the future history books. So I'll leave you with that uncertainty, but as an analyst, that's the best I can do. Thank you.
ナイ先生、ありがとうございました。アメリカ外交の現状を歴史の中で位置づけて、その特徴を浮かび上がらせてくださいました。トランプ政権自身についてはこれからどこに向かうかわからない。 現状でその評価をするのはまだ時期尚早というお話でございました。ナイ先生、どうもありがとうございました。